You are.
Here I am. Yay.
You guys are live.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or if you're with Michael in Sydney, Australia, good morning. How are you, Michael?
I'm very well. I'm very well. It's an overcast morning here, although it's rather hard in my cabana of cruelty, my writing room, to sort of stop the morning light sort of making me look like I'm a shadow.
Well, it's raining and cold here, which is why you see me in my leather jacket and my scarf, because, and you know what, the sports gods.
It never rains in Arizona, does it?
Well, it has rain. We've had more rain in Arizona since August than Seattle.
Oh, wow.
It's just been crazy. But we just finished up with the Super Bowl and the Phoenix Open, and it was a gorgeous weekend. And amazingly, as soon as it was over, it got cold and rainy. I mean,
yeah.
Maybe the NFL has a pipeline.
I watched the highlights of the Super Bowl. I didn't watch the whole game. It goes on too long for me.
It does go on a long time, but it was great. And I'm convinced the NFL has some deal with the above powers to prevent this weather. But anyway, we are here to talk about Lying Beside You, which is Michael's third book with Cyrus Haven. But before we get to that, since it is actually still Valentine's Day here in the US, even though it's tomorrow in Australia, I want to show everybody my Valentine, because for some miracle, this Valentine looks exactly like our puppy, Scooter, who is, as I told Michael, about to come home from the groomer, and he will be all this fluffy. He will have a bow. He will smell amazing, and it will last until, if we're lucky, tomorrow morning. So I don't know how my husband ever found this perfect. It even feels like a puppy when you cover it. I love it. So, Michael, how did you spend Valentine's Day?
Well, sadly, I was on the road driving. Had a long drive back from Canberra, which is our nation's capital. And so it was a McDonald's drive-through with my wife. I did apologize to her and say I will try to make it up to her sometime in the future, but it couldn't be helped. I had a big event on in Canberra yesterday, and then we had to get home last night. So it'll be, you know, look, every night is Valentine's Day night for my wife, let's face it.
Wow, isn't that a nice thing to say?
She's not listening in now. That's why I know I can say that.
No, I love it. So, in fact, yesterday, by our standards, was Michael's publication day. And today, Tuesday, February 14th, is in fact the publication day. But if I remember right, Michael, the UK publishes on Thursday.
No, the UK publishers were actually months ago.
Oh, they were?
Yeah, and Canada was about 10 days ago, but the UK, and I know I get a lot of irate American readers of mine at saying, because they see my social media posts and they go, well, what do you mean we can't get it until February? And unfortunately, it's just the way, the nature of, you know, American publishing. They want greater lead times before they publish your books, and I delivered too late for them to get it out by sort of August, September last year for their point of view. But no, it's never ideal when the book is coming out at different places at different times, because the really, really eager fans will find a way of accessing the book. They'll order it in. They'll know someone in another part of the world who will get it for them or whatever. But I'm just thrilled that it's finally out in America, and hope everyone enjoys it.
I'm sure they will. I certainly did. I mean, actually, the real danger of having the book come out at different times is that there are always spoilers, because somebody will post a review in which they give away the entire book. And so
I know.
My advice to American readers is try not to read any reviews of Lying Beside You until you've actually read the book, because Michael's very good at tricky plots, which is why he has won 2 Gold Daggers and 2 Ned Kelly Awards, which is Australia's version of the Oscars for authors. Although I love the idea that it was named for a hangman, which I think is a wonderfully Australian.
Yeah, name for a bushranger, which is our sort of, I guess, in Britain they'd call it a highwayman, like a highway robber. We called them bushrangers. In America, they'd be outlaws. I mean, like a Jesse James type figure, Ned Kelly. No, he's our most famous outlaw. And our big crime awards are named after him, which is quite fitting.
It is very nice. So there's a nifty little introduction that came with this is my advanced reading copy, because the real books are down at the bookstore and I'm at home in my library. But let me just share a few highlights of this with you. Michael is a former investigative journalist whose best-selling psychological thrillers have been translated into 25 languages, hence all the different publication dates. He's twice won the UK's Gull Dagger, which I mentioned, for Best Crime Novel, and twice won a Ned Kelly Award, which is Australia's Best Crime Novel Award. And as I mentioned, actually, Michael's been to see us only once that I can recall. Breaks my heart. Do you remember when you came to Scottsdale?
I do. I remember it very well. And I think every time we do, and obviously for COVID meant we had to do Zoom events. And each time I sort of seem to promise you at the end, I promise you, Mike, Barbara, next time I'll be there in person.
You know, you're a classic unreliable narrator.
Well,
Because
it is a long way. It is a long way.
I know it is. But you know what? Australia has sent us authors. We just had Jane Harper here. Week before last, Sulari Gentle has been here, quite a few. Derfla McTurnan.
And I do. And it's funny because I have my eldest child lives in Nashville now. It was in LA, lives in Nashville. So I did spend Christmas over your neck of the woods, but it didn't correspond with the publication. So,
well, let me just pause and say that a visit from you does not need to coincide with a publication.
Oh, okay.
Michael, come on.
Okay. I shall. Next time I come to America to visit my eldest child, I will make a point of coming to see you.
That would be really nice. You're going to fly right overhead on your way to Nashville, so it's not that hard to drop down.
Yeah.
And besides, you have such an enormous backlist that, you know, we're never going to be without books that we can discuss. We could go all the way back and talk about The Night Fairy, which was the book that Michael came to see us with, which had one of my
favorite. You remember that? Oh, wow.
I'm never going to forget it because your plot was so amazing. And I don't get suckered all that often, but you really surprised me with one of the twists in that book. I thought, seriously? I mean, that was so clever.
Well, I'm glad. I'm glad you think that's my wife's, of all my books, that's my wife's favorite book that I've ever written.
It's my favorite too, because I mean, the originality goes a long way with me. And, you know, that was one in which I thought you scored huge points. But seriously, next time you go to visit your son, regardless of where you are in the publication process, do come by. That would be lovely. But we're going to be talking now. The whole point of this, in fact, was Lying Beside You, which I mentioned earlier. And Cyrus Haven is a really interesting character. But Michael has written at least one other series character in addition to his standalones, which, in fact, The Night Fairy was. And that was the Joe O'Loughlin series. Have you abandoned Joe at this point, or are you just giving him a rest?
No, I think... I mean, it's hard to say never, you know, that I'll never bring him back. But I guess one of the issues with Joe O'Loughlin, and for people watching who may not have read them, I never intended to write a series when I created the Joe O'Loughlin character. I thought it would be a standalone book. And I love the tragic irony of creating a main character who had this brilliant mind, but a crumbling body. So I gave him early onset Parkinson's. He was sort of the anti-Jack Reacher and the anti-James Bond and the anti-Jason Bourne. He was going to have to use his incredible intelligence and insights into human behavior to solve the crimes. He wasn't going to be able to outfight, outdrive, you know, outbed, you know, outshoot everyone else in the story. But in a sense, by giving Joe O'Loughlin Parkinson's, I created a use-by date for him, because as I did, I aged him in real time over the course of 10 years and 9 books. And his disease slowly progressed. So I knew there was a point of time where I couldn't carry on doing Joe. And but I've always, you know, I've done it very much. I always think it's very much like Michael Connolly did with Bosch when he you know, Bosch's daughter enters the police force, the LAPD, and it gives Michael that opportunity at some point. I thought, well, if Bosch gets to the point where he's got you can't write about him anymore, you can't keep investigating, you can always bring his daughter into the story and have her as the main character. And so I've created a situation with Joe O'Loughlin that his daughter Charlie, in the very last book, is at university studying psychology. And so I've left a little window open for myself where I could potentially bring her back and him back as mentor into a future book.
You certainly could. Have you ever considered a prequel before he got Parkinson's to see what would see him?
One of the great problems with that, Barbara, is because he was always an accidental investigator. He was a clinical psychologist that gets dragged by kicking and screaming often into these investigations because he wants to spend his life helping people get over their sort of trauma and psychological problems, not to delve into, but he's not a professional forensic psychologist that is hired to look into these crimes. He's very much someone who's dragged into them. And so the very first book, The Suspect, was the very first crime he'd ever been asked to look at. So it becomes hard to do a prequel, given that that's pretty much established in that first book, that was the first time he'd ever had anything to do with the police or been asked to profile a killer. And so that sort of limited me. Because again, when I wrote, I honestly thought, typical, I don't know, it was typical from my point of view. When I wrote that first novel, I wrote 117 pages, which triggered a bidding war at the London Book Fair, and it got sold into 20 odd translations in 3 hours. But up until that point, I honestly thought that if I was lucky enough to get a novel published, it would sell 12 copies and my mother would buy 8 of them. And the thought that I would, 20 years later be here talking to you with my 17th novel, it was just beyond the possibilities of anything I'd ever imagined. So I didn't sort of plan to have this sort of long career. I haven't got a story arc that says what comes next. I finish each book convinced it's the last one I'll ever write. And then I hope I can come up with another idea for the next one.
Wow, to live in perpetual panic, not panic, but perpetual, what's the word I want? Not anticipation, but the opposite of it.
Yeah, no, I know because I envy those writers that simply finish a book and they open their bottom drawer and it's full of ideas and they just pluck another one out and thinking, oh, this one will do. Because, I'm the opposite. I finish thinking that every decent description, one-liner, plot twist, it's all gone. I'm this empty vessel. I'll have to get a proper job.
All used up. Oh, poor thing. I had a really fascinating conversation. We do Jonathan Kellerman's book launch and only event. And we did it last night. And as you may know, Alex Delaware is also a professional psychologist. You might want to watch it. I will send you the link because it lives up there forever.
I did know. Actually, I did notice it on the Facebook page.
Well, I'm serious. You really ought to listen to it. How Jonathan created Alex and how he got into police work and why he doesn't accept a job from the LAPD, but prefers to keep himself he has a kind of tunnel in without actually being employed by the LAPD, and how Jonathan goes about it. Jonathan is, in fact, a brilliant psychologist, but not a forensic psychologist. But he, too, is interested in helping people. And the book has a lot to do with a very naive character who, in an effort to help people, creates as I said to Jonathan, and I've said this before, a really great mystery makes you mourn the villain. Mourn the victim. You want to really care about the person who died and feel it as a loss. And Jonathan really excelled himself with the victim in the book we discussed last night. I'm going blank. It's Unnatural something. Anyway.
No, it's very true. I mean, it's one of the things. I mean, my knowledge of psychology comes because when I was a ghostwriter, and before I was a journalist initially, and then I was a ghostwriter. And I worked as a ghostwriter with a man called Paul Britton, who is the pioneer of offender profiling in the UK, and worked on many of the most celebrated crimes through the 90s and 2000s in the UK, like Fred and Rosemary West, the House of Horrors. He was involved in that investigation. But Paul Britton always talked to me about, in terms of you talking about the importance of the victim, often when a psychologist is called into a crime scene, they only have the victim, and the only way they can discover and think about the psychological clues is to look at the victim's life and the victim's personality and the victim's behavior. And by knowing the victim, they can understand how that killer and the victim interacted in those minutes before the death. And it's about recreating the victim in your mind before you begin starting to try to walk through in the shoes or to look through the eyes of the killer.
Absolutely. And the victim's ties to the potential suspects for whatever happened. But you'd also find there's a shadow, not an outright villain, but a shadow character in the book. And I think Jonathan does a really clever thing with him. So I really recommend it to you.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Cyrus. And this book opens, I think, in a really tough situation. And I've often wondered how people would cope with it, which is to say that Cyrus's older brother. Well, you tell it. It's your story.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think
Cyrus has got a tragic backstory. At the age of 13, he came home from football practice, sort of 6 o'clock of an evening, and discovers his parents are dead and his twin sisters are dead. And they have been killed by his paranoid schizophrenic older brother, Elias, who is sent to he's 13 when this happens. It's 20 years ago. But Elias is sent to a secure psychiatric hospital, and Cyrus still visits him. But the book opens with Elias, after 20 years, applying to be released from this psychiatric hospital, saying that he's better now. He's been medicated properly. You know, he obviously had paranoid schizophrenia, and he didn't know what he was doing when he committed those crimes. And Cyrus his initial dilemma is he's sitting there saying, do I accept this man back in my life? I mean, he's my only family. Do I forgive him? And it is a real moral dilemma, that idea of whether, it's what reading groups have talked a lot about this book, is to say, could I forgive someone who'd done that, who did that to me? And Cyrus, given that he's a forensic psychologist, he above all people should understand mental illness and understand that his brother did not understand what he was doing. But still a huge leap, isn't it? To forgive someone destroys your childhood and takes away your entire family. And so that is the initial dilemma. The book opens at a mental health tribunal hearing where Cyrus is listening to all these experts talk to the judges and adjudicators, saying, no, he's well enough to be released into the community. And Cyrus has to decide, but do I want him back? Do I want him back in my life?
Well, but the other problem is that if he is released, he's going to be released to Cyrus. He's not going to be released to some. So Cyrus not only has to accept the idea of release and forgiveness, but he also has to undertake a caregiver role. And if I remember right, the release is sort of probationary. It's not like they just turned him loose and said, okay, you're done.
No, it initially starts off as normally happens in this. It's like a day release just for during daylight hours. And then it might be an overnight release, and then or a weekend release. And all of it is a staged process before they decide whether someone should be, in Elias's case, should be released, full time. And you're right. And so it's not just a case of knowing he's out there somewhere. He's going to be coming to live with Cyrus. Cyrus is going to be his, I guess, carer is, his chaperone in a sense. And watching for those clues as to whether Elias is coping, because it's a huge thing. But after 20 years, when you think how the world has moved on in the last 20 years, things like streaming TV and Spotify and all it's all new to Elias. He's been locked away. So much of the world, smartphones, the fact that people spend their life on these smartphones, all of it is completely new to Elias. And that also, he's always had this incredibly in a psychiatric hospital. His day is regimented. He knows exactly when he eats, and food's provided and activities are done. And suddenly on his own, it's all him, and he's got to cope with that sort of pressure of even just finding things to do. And and you sort of know that it's going to, you always feel like right from the opening chapter that he's this ticking bomb. You can always sort of hear and you're just hoping that it's a slow tick and that it never starts speeding up.
Well, it's up to Cyrus to provide that structure in addition to observing clues and trying to decide whether Elias is better. We'll get to the fact that Cyrus already has somebody living with him who may not find this blend particularly easy to cope with. But, there's also, just because Cyrus might decide that he can accept his brother back, the rest of the community may not feel that way at all. And so there's outside pressure very often. I mean, we see it around here when, sex offenders are released and, neighborhoods don't quite know what to do with it. There's also, I mean, I can draw back to my own legal experience. I've never forgotten. There was a case in Virginia when I was a lawyer there in which somebody who had been imprisoned for violent behavior and threats to his wife. And, they pleaded mental illness and on. And the guy was released, and within hours, he tracked down his wife and killed her. I mean, never deviated, and all the psychologists or prison people who said, oh, no, he's going to be fine. We can let him out, And so there's a not surprising distrust in the community as to whether the people who evaluate Elias actually can or even know what they're doing.
Yeah, it is the great dilemma because, we tend to, in the community, we don't hear about the successful people that are sort of, released from prison and go on to lead, full lives and honest lives and law-abiding lives. We hear about the mistakes where someone gets out and reoffends. And it's interesting, there are figures that I give in this book, when people are released from, people like Elias with paranoid schizophrenia have about an 80% chance of finishing back up in a psychiatric hospital. Not necessarily for having committed the same sort of crime that they went in there initially for, but it's a huge, it's an issue, and it's one of those ones that I read a lot about, those sort of cases that you're talking about where people were released and reoffended. And similarly, I read a lot of stories, amazing stories, how, and some of them I allude to in the book, when Cyrus is talking about forgiveness, whether forgiving someone releases a burden from you, he recalls, and this is based on real life cases, a mother who'd lost their only child, had been murdered, but in court, in the victim impact statement, forgave the person that killed her son. And it's, how can anyone forgive? How could anyone do that? But, and this woman sobbed and sort of said it was like having released this incredible weight from her chest and I wanted to explore all those areas I wanted to explore this idea of forgiveness, whether it's something, because I think it's possible to forgive someone too early. I think it's possible to forgive someone who doesn't deserve to be forgiven, who doesn't show contrition. But I also, to a degree, think that to go through life with this attitude that you will never forgive does burden you enormously. And there is a weight that can be lifted by saying, it's like when friends do things that you don't like, we all know people that will just cut them off, never, ever, ever. And others that will go, okay, I accept the fact that was a mistake. I will forgive them. And hopefully they won't do it again.
Well, let me tell you, I've learned some very hard lessons managing a staff for 33 years along those lines. But, as I was relating that earlier case, one of the really big debates is, what do you owe the community in terms of safety, as opposed to what do you owe an individual who may, in fact, have been rehabilitated? How do you, how do you balance the rights and the life of the individual, the offender, against the welfare of the community? And if you guess it wrong, it's really horrendous.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, there is a famous, I think I allude this, I think in this book, but maybe it's a previous one. I allude to a very famous British jurist who talked about the fact that when it comes to deciding, guilt, this idea, I'm sure you've often heard the term, I'd rather 10 guilty people walk free than seeing an innocent person convicted. Now, it's quite interesting. You talk to people, and some are considering, no, I don't want to see 10 killers walk free. I'd rather see one innocent person go to jail. But it's all fine if it's not you. If you're the innocent person, or if it's someone you
Right.
know, but it's that we make these decisions all the time in terms of our judicial system, in terms of, beyond reasonable doubt, in terms of conviction, or whatever. And similarly, it used to be with mental illness, before we established a rule of law where if someone was incapable of understanding their actions, they could not be found guilty. They would be found innocent on the grounds of insanity. Before that, it was called the wild beast test. Basically, if someone was scratching at themselves and defecating in the corner and like a wild animal, that's the only reason that they could never be convicted of a crime. And then as the psychiatry and psychology developed, it was deemed that we were going to have a system where experts would say, okay, was someone capable of understanding their actions? And so you either just have a society that simply say, no, we just lock them up. We lock them up, we never let them go, we don't take that risk, or you weigh that up, as you say, with individual freedoms as to whether someone can be rehabilitated. And if you don't believe rehabilitation is possible, then you're going to suggest that, you may as well execute them then and there rather than spending taxpayer dollars on keeping them alive.
Well, I have to say that in a purely selfish spirit, I'm always relieved when one of these mass shooters or a serial killer or even a terrorist ends up dead before we ever get to the judicial system.
I understand. I guess one of the issues, and maybe because I was a journalist for so long, and again, journalists tend not to cover stories when things go right. They cover stories when things go wrong. And so I covered, miscarriages of justice, where basically, through either the police desperation to get a conviction, evidence was either withheld or fabricated or whatever. But, periodically we see these people being released, have spent 20, 25 years in prison, and suddenly DNA proves it wasn't them, and they'd always maintained their innocence, and again, this is why, I personally, and I know everyone's got a right to their opinion, I don't believe in the death penalty, only because I've seen too many mistakes made, and if we had a perfect system where we knew absolutely that there's no way an innocent person could be convicted of a crime, then I might think differently. But we don't have a perfect system, and and I've seen too many miscarriages of justice for me to believe that we can, but by the same token, as you say, when it's absolute cut and dried, when you've got a mass shooter who is, it's clear who, then I feel,
I just want to save us all the trauma, the clickbaits, the expense, the whole bit.
Expense, yeah, as you say, because keeping someone in prison is more expensive than keeping them in the most luxurious hotel room you can imagine. I mean, the cost is enormous.
Yeah, no, it's tremendous. So, these are all moral issues that we're not going to solve in a crime novel, that's for sure. But well, we're thinking about, and one of the advantages of reading crime fiction is that there are so often moral or ethical issues that arise. I like the idea, as I've frequently heard quoted, in which I think is that it tends to cut along the edge of social change and examine these difficult issues through the medium of fiction and make us all think.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's one of those things that crime fiction does very well. It used to be a lot more in the remit of literary fiction to examine sort of big social issues of crime, punishment, justice, redemption or whatever. But I think now it's very much what the best of the crime novels are doing, shining a light into the dark corners of society and the human mind, and examining them, but doing it in such a way that it's not preaching. It's just a story. You're telling, hopefully, a cracking good story, but along the way you have these moral sort of dilemmas and questions that people do ask themselves. What would I do in that situation? Would
Absolutely true. And also thankfully say they're not in that situation. It reminds me, P.D. James years and years ago talked about the comfort of reading a crime novel. And she said, you lie on the bed and you know that the footstep on the stair is not coming for you. Which I think
also, Pete, I remember she also said that only murder will do when it comes to crime novels, because she felt as though murder was the only crime that you cannot make recompense for. You cannot bring someone back. And that she also felt as though one of the things that people liked to do with it, as you say, in the comfort of their home, was that she felt as though we were all capable of murder in the right circumstances, pushed hard enough with all the buttons pushed. And a little part of us wanted to just explore that dark side about, when we read crime fiction.
Well, she was, I did a wonderful event conversation with her in Scottsdale many years ago. I think it was 1996, if I remember. And she gave an impassioned, at least hour-long in our discussion, just talked about these very things that we're talking about, how crime fiction allows you to, examine so many deep issues, and how her version of her view of murder that you just discussed. And it was really profound and everybody was engaged. And then when the questions opened up, the first thing that happened is some guy stood up and he said, "When are you going to write a real book?"
Oh,
never forgotten that, I mean, so
right.
it was
it's just
well, there was a long time, and particularly true in Britain. I can remember writing to the Times as part of a study about it, where crime fiction was really put down as genre fiction, and the only real respect went to literary fiction, and it took some huge breakthroughs.
Yeah, to a degree, I mean, the late great Peter Temple, Australian crime writer, who was the first Australian to win the Gold Dagger. And he was the first. He also won the Miles Franklin, which is our highest literary award. So he wrote a crime novel which won our highest literary award, and no one anywhere in the world could think of when that had happened anywhere in the world. And a judge, a former chair of the judging panel of the Booker Prize in the UK, was asked if they could ever foresee a situation where a crime writer would be shortlisted for the Booker. And he said that would be like putting a cart horse in the Grand National, just like the big horse race, a cart horse in the Grand National. I mean, that's how dismissive he was, of the idea, But the world, I think it is slowly moving, but there's still a degree of that exists, that snobbery, that literary snobbery still exists.
Well, right. Well, we can't change that, but it's worth thinking about. But let's talk a little bit here about Evie, because the other person there's a trio here, and the third leg of this book is Evie Cormack, who, as I mentioned earlier, lives with Cyrus. So, and her life is truly going to be affected if Elias comes to live with Cyrus, because she already lives in his house. So talk to us about Evie.
Yeah, Evie, I mean, this is the third book in a series, but each of them can be read as standalones. But Evie, initially, Cyrus comes across Evie in a secure children's home, and she is petitioning to be released, claiming to be 18, but nobody knows her true age or her true name, because at a very young age, she was found hiding in a secret room in a house where a man had been tortured to death. And she refused to reveal how she got there or her name. So the courts had given her a name. They nominated an age for her. One of the things Cyrus discovers very early on, that Evie has a skill. It's not a gift, it's actually a curse. Evie can tell when someone is lying. And this has sort of been, and Cyrus has always been protected, because he figures if people discover that Evie's got this skill, they will want to experiment on her. They will want to, exploit her. So he realized she's such a damaged young woman. She's now a young woman in this book, that he's very protective of her. But he's also, as you say, well aware that when Elias comes back into this house, you can sort of see these two are going to clash. Mm-hmm. And Evie is obviously very protective of Cyrus, because it's one of those things that it's as though the two of them are incredibly damaged people, and together they're going to save each other. And so she's the sort of person that says, I don't think you should forgive your brother. I don't think you should be letting him back into your house. And she's going to be watching Elias, and because she's got this ability to tell when someone's lying, you just know she's going to be feeling her way, thinking, can I find out, is this guy really better? Is he really, changed? Or is the old Elias still hiding somewhere inside?
Well, if he is a paranoid schizophrenic, I'm not sure, that you can actually consciously tell if he's
lying. Well, this
lying.
is a great thing with Evie. Evie's skill, it only works if people don't realize they're telling a lie, then Evie can't pick the lie. You know what I mean? So it's a situation if Elias truly believes what he's saying, then Evie's not going to be able to tell.
Right.
And so she's still only very young, and she doesn't really understand the parameters of what she can and can't do. But she hates the fact she can tell when people are lying, because it's I say it's a curse, because we lie, each of us lies between 10 and 200 times a day. And you've been to lunch today and you probably don't think you've told a lie, but you will have. You'll have said to someone, gee, you're looking good. I love that outfit. Oh, that's so interesting. Or you've said to someone, I'm 5 minutes away, or it must have gone to spam, or I bought it on special, or I only had the one glass of wine. We lie all the time for the people we love for the best possible reasons. But just imagine what it would be like to go through life and three little words like, I love you, become damaging because you suddenly think that's a lie. And so Evie, it's a curse, but it's a very interesting vehicle to have in a crime novel, to have someone like Evie.
So you don't have to explain how it works, but she must be really good at tells, at facial expression, whatever it is. Do you give any explanation? I mean,
well, it's an interesting thing, because one of the world's leading expert on lying is a man called Professor Paul Ekman. He's based in California. And I don't remember, quite a number of years ago, there was a TV series called Lie to Me.
right.
And that was based on the work of Paul Ekman. And he talked about micro expressions, the tiny, poke a tell is a good idea, but basically that people give off these tiny, almost subliminal expressions that some people can pick up and some people can't. And it's interesting that he came up with this term truth wizard. And about 1 in 500 people have the ability, about an 80% ability, to tell when someone's lying. Not just verbally, but emotionally, like the fake tears, the fake smile, they can pick it up. About 1 in 500 have an 80% ability. And often that is because they have spent their career in law enforcement, in prison services, in child services, or they have been lied to their entire lives. And they have just learned to pick up on these signals and clues. There is increasing evidence that when young people have this ability, it's often because they've come from a very violent, dysfunctional background. Perhaps a family where they have had to decide in a split second whether they're going to be hit or hugged. That sort of growing up with a hair trigger temper. And so Evie's ability, and I've never fully, explained why, because I want to keep that open. It could come because she's had this incredibly violent past that she's developed this ability. But there are people like Evie that exist.
Right. Well, you don't want to be like the Great Oz, and draw back the curtain for the reader. I mean, I just wondered if you yourself, had explored it. I mean, there are other crime writers who have written about, like, say, synesthesia, for example. There are several conditions that have appeared in crime novels where somebody has what appears to be a kind of, if not superhuman, extra human anyway.
I've done a lot of and I've done a lot of reading on savantism, if you know what I mean. I mean, there are many, many examples like of people that have either suffered a fall or an accident, or autistic savants, obviously a very good example, where they suddenly have this Rain Man-like ability that's visited upon. And And it can be a slow-growing tumor in the brain. There are so many possible reasons, and there are enough examples of people that suddenly, literally, fall over, wake up, and can speak 5 languages, never having been taught them. And you think, how is that?
I know, wasn't there a London cab driver or somewhere that was cited the other day for being able to speak 23 languages? You know, he just had a gift for it. I mean, my gift is speed reading. People are always saying you can't possibly read that many books. Well, actually, I do. And I've never tried to learn it. You know, my mother was very good at it. And it's I'm sure it's a combination of eye movement and attention span and memory and a whole lot of things.
And it's interesting because, and I know, no, you're absolutely right. And I know with someone like Evie, I completely agree that there are other crime novels that have these abilities. My initial, I mean, I've been fascinated by lying for about 20, 25 years. I began reading the works of Paul Ekman, but I could never work out how I could include it in the book, because if you tell someone that you're a crime writer and you're creating a character who can tell when someone's lying, you're on track to write the shortest crime novel in history. I mean, if Evie Cormack was Hercule Poirot, she'd just get everyone in the room at the very beginning and go, did you do it? Did you do it? Did you do it? Case solved.
Right.
But the only way to make Evie work in a book was to make her young and damaged, and also she's a compulsive liar. So even though she knows when someone else is lying, she can't lie straight in bed. She's always lying to others. She's making up stories. She's sort of, and so therefore no one really believes Evie at times, other than Cyrus, when Evie says, you know, things that people just think, well, she's a liar. Why would you believe anything she says? So I had to create Evie in such a way to make her so damaged, so unpredictable, because otherwise, yeah, I mean, she would become the world's greatest detective and be involved in the shortest books in history.
Well, that would be a real problem for you. But, you know, it just made me think is that you did a substantial amount of ghostwriting. How did you know when you were doing ghostwriting whether you were being lied to?
Well, it's a really, really good question, that, because there are times, at the time, there were times I was lied to. One of the, I mean, this is not a figure that's well known in America, but there's a figure well known in the UK and Australia called Rolf Harris, who was an entertainer. And about 10 years after I ghostwrote his autobiography, he was exposed during the Me Too movement as being a pedophile. And now, I never asked him the question when I was working on the book, are you a pedophile? There was never it's not the sort of thing you'd suddenly just come out and ask someone. I always thought he was a bit of a lech, you know, in terms of he used to joke about the fact he was a bit of a, you know, he thought he was being a Jack the Lad, you know, that, you know, pinching a woman on the bum was sort of, you know, a cheeky chappy sort of thing, rather than, you know, it's an assault, you know, I mean, because he was a man of his generation. But I remember when I discovered, when he was charged and he went to court, being initially beating myself up, thinking, why didn't I see it? And then I finally thought, well, his wife of 35 years didn't see it. So I sort of figure, why should I, having spent, you know, 8 months working with him, why should it have been me? But I did initially think I should have seen it. I should have seen that, you know, yeah. But I mean, it's a case that I'm not Evie Cormack.
Right. Well, no, I just wondered if it had sharpened your own, you know, perception. Have you worked with that? You know, we're having this whole thing going on with George Santos about a person who clearly is a compulsive liar and fabulist and actually glories in it and seems to feel like everyone should applaud him for it rather than, you know, and I mean, I understand the political calculus, which is the Republicans don't want to give up his one vote. But the truth is, you know, he shouldn't be, and he's not even the person that those who voted for him thought he was. But what's interesting to me is that nobody picked up on it, even though the trail behind him was absolutely littered.
And I tell you why that is. It's something that psychologists call the liar's advantage. And that is the fact that if you meet someone for the first time and they say to you that they're an airline pilot, you know, unless they're sort of severely, you're not going to say, oh, that's a lie.
Right.
But you always think to yourself, well, why would they lie? You know, and most of Sanders' lying, why would he lie about that? He didn't need to lie about that. So the liar's advantage is that people are hardwired. We're hardwired to believe what people tell us, unless we're shown evidence they're untrustworthy. And that is the liar's advantage. And that's why con men and con women are so effective, is because they prey on that fact that our initial reaction is, yeah, well, why would he lie? So that's true, and
That's true. And we're all moving so fast, we don't really want to dig beneath the surface or whatever facade is presented to us. But all of this, of course, is actual grist for the crime novels. So we can't go much further. I mean, we've had this long discussion about the three characters because we don't want to ruin the plot, but you will not be surprised if I say that Elias comes home. We have to deal with all that. And then amazingly, something happens. So what happens, Michael, without going too far into it?
Oh, what can I say happens? How much can I say?
Well, it says right here on the back of the book that let's just say that a man is murdered. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the midst of all of Cyrus having to deal with the idea that Elias is coming home, he is a forensic psychologist. He is employed by the police,
Right.
and he is asked to investigate the murder of a man and the disappearance of his daughter. And it turns out that this daughter that's disappeared has disappeared from the bar that Evie Cormack works in. So there's a link. The two cases are going to link over. So Cyrus has got this to deal with and doing his sort of day job, so to speak, at the same time as he's got Elias coming home. And then you have, I think, to me, the richest sort of area are those moments when Elias and Evie, because you're waiting for that time that Elias meets Evie. And from that moment onwards, you're sort of thinking, there are going to be sort of fireworks here. And without giving anything away, I would like the idea that I subvert people's expectations. They think that certain people are the villains in this story, and they turn out to be the heroes in the story, and that sort of thing.
Well, that makes it really fun. We also should bear in mind that you have to always ask yourself in any well-constructed crime plot what the role of coincidence is. Is there, in fact, any coincidence, or is something that happens a real coincidence?
It's really interesting that, isn't it? Because I mean, there are several stories of mine where I often worry too much about coincidence. I mean, because I think it might have been, I'm trying to remember. There's a famous quote about writers having to avoid writing with God on your lap, and that idea that if your plot relies too much on an outrageous coincidence,
right,
then you probably should rewrite your plot. Because we all know outrageous coincidences exist. We've all bumped into people that we haven't seen in years, just literally minutes after we've thought about them. You haven't seen them in years, and suddenly you see them and you think, well, that's spooky. I mean, coincidences happen.
Right. But you've already mentioned that the daughter that disappears is somebody that worked in Evie's bar. So right there, the astute reader says, aha, is this coincidence?
It's a coincidence, yeah.
Yeah.
And you sort of, and I think, I mean, because, the Evie and Cyrus books are told in the two voices. You're hearing from Evie's first person point of view and Cyrus's first person point of view. You ultimately need to make sure that one story doesn't overpower the other, and that the two stories sort of meet, which is what a lot of my plotting difficulties are always, to make sure that both their stories gel.
Well, that's another interesting facet, I think, of Michael's writing, is that there are multiple points of view. Often it isn't a single narrator. It isn't necessarily in first person or past or whatever it might be. It's a really tricky thing, I think, to have multiple narrators and make it all work, make the voices really distinctive. There are limits to a first person narrative, which is then the person telling the story can only know things that person can't actually know. Whereas if you have multiple narrators, then the reader gets to know things that maybe one of the narrators doesn't know and all. But, it takes a lot of skill.
It does, and most of my books have been first person, and maybe a reflection on the fact that I was a ghostwriter for so long, where I wrote, 15 autobiographies, help 15 famous people write their autobiographies in the first person. Right. That I'm more comfortable in the first person. It's not many crime writers do it first person, because it does limit you, as you say, to things have to happen within eyesight or earshot of. Or you could do what Harlan Coben does and just go first person, and suddenly when you need it, just drop a third person in.
Well, and that is not that uncommon. And years ago, I think it was the same kind of right around the time that the P.D. James story I mentioned to you. We did a conference in Scottsdale in 1996. Actually, the three guests of honor were P.D. James, Tony Hillerman, and Robert B. Parker. But then we had the next year, that was so successful, we brought together a group of authors, and one of them did a really brilliant paper, which we then published, actually got nominated for an Edgar for publishing the collected papers of this conference, about Treasure Island. And he pointed out that Stevenson worked on Treasure Island and he got stuck and he just couldn't go on with the story. And I don't remember whether he went from first person to third or third person to first, but whatever it was.
First person to third. He went
Was
from
that
first
it?
person to third.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, he recognized then that, the narrative needed to have this switch. And that most people who read Treasure Island don't even think
don't see. Oh no, you're absolutely right. It's an interesting, and taste, things change as well. It's a bit like, we now live in an era where you stay in someone's head, even if you're going to switch. You in any particular scene, you're in one person's, head.
Right.
You're not suddenly having what the person they're with is thinking. You're just having what your sort of person is thinking. Whereas going back to, the great Russian writers of the past, they'd be in everyone's head at the same time. And now we'd normally say, oh no, you've jumped point of view there. You should stay in one point of view and then break a chapter or break a scene and then go into another point of view. But styles change.
Well, but it depends on the skill of the writer. It depends on the story that you want to tell. As you point out, you write in first person, but now in this book, you can write in, more than...
It's multiple first person, yeah.
Well, okay, but, it's two different voices. And, an awful lot of people start in first person because it's easier. You're telling the story yourself. But I do think as writers grow, and as you've pointed out, you've written 17, maybe, is this number 18?
This is number 17.
Number 17. You're bound to learn things over the course of writing.
And as you say,
novels.
Yeah, I've done third person. I've done it all now in terms of different books, a bit different sort of. So I've experimented with them all, but probably tend to gravitate back to first person.
Yeah, but don't you think that the story probably tells you at this point how you want to tell it?
Yeah, unfortunately. Because I don't know the story when I start, I don't have it plotted out.
Making it up as you go along.
I make it up as I go along, and I never know how it's going to end when I start, or even halfway through. I rarely know how it's going to end. I write myself into lots of corners at times.
Well, obviously, successfully, you wouldn't have won so many awards, and you are a very, very fine stylist, which makes you a pleasure to read. Since you've already said that you have no idea what comes next, do I dare ask you if you have another book in the works?
I have. I'm doing another Evie and Cyrus book, which is going to be called Before You Found Me. And it's going to be talking about origin stories earlier. It's going to be more, we're going to learn, there's a modern day story, but then we're also going to learn about Evie's full backstory in this one. We really unpack her past and discover where she came from and how she got in that secret room, where in the house where the man had been murdered. Because we've never really, we've got little snippets in the books where she's dropped little hints, but she's never revealed, even to Cyrus, the full detail of how she got in that.
So you've already seeded the story, but you haven't limited yourself with too much information that will force you.
I remember when I wrote the first in the series, Good Girl, Bad Girl, and people said to me, because at the end of that book, you don't discover how Evie got in the room. You discover a lot, but you don't discover. And people sort of said, well, how did she get in the room? People would come to me and say, well, I don't know. And I said, what do you mean you don't know? I said, well, I haven't decided yet. They're going, but you've just, how can you not decide? And I'm thinking, well, and you have to, I was stuck with the clues I planted in the first book.
That's right.
I couldn't change from those. I had to, and there were times I wanted to go, oh, why didn't I put this in the first book? But I just simply had to live with what I'd put down there. It's limiting, but it's a challenge.
Well, it keeps you busy, you know,
Yeah.
and probably keeps you interested. Let's call Jacob up and see if we have any questions from the audience, or if Jacob has any questions, because he often does. I love this magic square where suddenly it's revealed. Right. Hi
Hi,
there.
Michael.
Hi.
Yeah, you certainly have a lot of questions on Facebook. I think we have a time to get to a few of them. Tonya Ludwig had two questions for you. What is your writing process like? Do you have a standard daily schedule or routine?
Okay. Oh, my writing process, it's very much, I write every day. And I mean every day. I had a journalist come and interview me once. I was supposed to spend 3 days following me around to write 10,000 word piece on the life as a writer. And he gave up after a day. And I said, why? And I said, well, you don't do anything. I said, you're right. I sit, I sit and I make shit up. That is my life. It's not very exciting. But he said, but even on Christmas Day, he would talk to my wife. What did you do on Christmas Day? She said, well, he had dinner and then he went and wrote. And so I write every day. Otherwise I fall, I get terrified that my idea is terrible and I'm going to be exposed as being a complete fraud who doesn't know what he's doing. So I have to write every day just to keep telling myself it's okay. It's not a disaster, not yet.
Are you a morning writer or a nighttime writer or afternoon? Do you have a time?
I'm an all-day writer.
All day.
Yeah, well, I tend to start at sort of 8:30 in the morning and I'll finish at 5. Now, a lot of that time will be research or, you know what I say. I mean, the internet has been the greatest tool and the greatest waste of time ever created for a writer. Because I can honestly go online to research whether a human hair, whether you can tell whether a hair came from a dead body or a live person. And I can find that out within about 5 minutes. But 2 hours later, I'm looking at basketball results from some obscure American college, and I don't even follow college basketball. But suddenly you just go down this rabbit hole, and I'm gone.
This one's about Cyrus and Elias. How long did it take you to develop those characters? And were there a relationship or circumstance based on an actual case or a string of cases?
I guess a string of cases. I mean, there have been, and I'm sure cases in many cases in America like this, where one in particular, I remember a paranoid schizophrenic killed his parents, and his sister survived, and she had to, go through this whole process that Elias and Cyrus have gone through. And I remember thinking at the time, would she just abandon this brother? Would she stand by him? Would she visit him in the psychiatric hospital? I mean, or would she completely disown this? And she was older. She was a grown up when this happened, and the brother was a grown up, whereas Cyrus is very young. But I always remembered that case, thinking, what would I do in that situation? And it's so much as, so many, all writers will tell you, is that what if moment, that what if hook that you think, yeah, what if that was me? How would I react? Could I forgive? Would I forgive? And I guess that's being played out many times in every different country, where, it's no different from, mass shootings, a teenager that involved in a mass shooting in America, let's say, and we have to talk about Kevin. The Lon Shriver book covered this, and many other books have covered it. As a parent, you must continue to love your child, but how do you forgive them? I mean, how does that work? I mean, I'm fascinated by that sort of moral and ethical dilemma.
Now, was that your initial inspiration for the plot, or did you sit on it for a while after you read that?
I guess the initial inspiration came from Evie, wanting to create a character like Evie that could tell when someone was lying. And so when I wrote Good Girl, Bad Girl, it was about introducing Evie. And I did want to introduce a new psychologist. So I created Cyrus, and I wanted to give him a tragic backstory. And I thought, well, what if he was the lone survivor of and then I suddenly thought, well, hold on, maybe it's even more interesting. If he's not the lone survivor, what if it's his brother that commits the crime, and then he has to live in the shadow? And so one thing sort of led to another, in terms of each of you know, it's so often in that writing. I mean, Stephen King talks about this on writing, that sometimes you can look at your idea and you might flesh it out and you suddenly think to yourself, hold on, what if I just change my main character from a man to a woman? How would that change the story? Oh, and suddenly it opens up a whole new avenue of exploration. And so I don't plot in advance. So me, it's very much that idea of just letting it run and seeing where it finishes.
Great. Gel Cell asked, do you ever experiment to keep yourself interested in writing? I'm assuming just outside of your genre, usually, or your comfort zone.
I read mostly outside my genre, and that's because I get very easily influenced by what I'm reading. If I begin reading a James Lee Burke, I will suddenly begin to write like a very poor man's version of James Lee Burke. You know, it's like the voice. I mean, because in first person, I create this voice and I want to keep that voice in my head. And if I read a really good first person novel, I suddenly find that voice begins overtaking. And so I avoid reading in my genre or in first person when I'm writing in it. But I do look, I have great plans, which my publishers encourage me to do. I would love to write a Nick Hornby style, David Nichols style, sort of tragicomedy type book at some point. Because I try to put a lot of humor in my books anyway. But I would let people know. I wouldn't expect my crime readers. I would let them know it was a different book. I wouldn't expect my crime readers to pick it up thinking they're going to get the same thing as they normally get. I wouldn't publish under a fake name. I would probably just do like Ian Banks did with Ian M. Banks books and just use my initials or something just to let people know it's different.
Great. I think we're running short on time, Barbara.
No, we're okay. If
We're
there's
okay?
anything else, yeah.
We're all right. Yeah, we definitely have a few more questions. Did you want to talk about your background in investigative journalism and how that influenced your writing over the years?
Yeah, I mean, journalism, probably the two things that influenced me. Journalism, because I grew up in very small country towns and in a very idyllic childhood. And I don't think I'd experienced crime ever, you know, in my childhood, you know, or real tragedy or real hardship, you know. And so journalism, I felt as though I wanted to write from a very young age, but I had nothing to write about. So journalism gathered material, investigative journalism gathered material, and I met criminals and presidents and kings and psychopaths and so many people. So journalism gave me a body of knowledge to draw upon. And then ghostwriting helped me capture voice, because each of the people I ghostwrote for, and I ghostwrote for everyone from Jerry Halliwell of the Spice Girls to, you know, actors to politicians. Each of them had a unique voice, and that taught me how to capture voice and hopefully create characters that live and breathe on the page. And if they live and breathe for me, they should live and breathe for the reader, hopefully.
Now, because of your background, do you find it easy to write from your subconscious, or do you still need to be kind of knee deep in research?
I think because of my background, I need the research. All my books have been set in real life places, and the journalist in me means that factually they have to be correct. I have to have walked that street. I mean, I periodically get picked up by people who say, oh, by the way, you can't turn right at that intersection. It's a one-way street. And often I'll go back and find out, yeah, but it became a one-way street about 5 months ago. You could turn right there when I was there. But and people contact me and say, oh, sadly, that laundromat burned down. I'm saying, well, I can't do much about that, you know. But no, the journalist in me means that I have to set it in real places, and the research has to be as accurate as, you know. I'm trying to create fiction that reads like nonfiction. I want the readers to think, this sounds so true. This could really be happening. So and the journalism background is part of that, wanting to create something that reads like it's really happening.
Great. Well, one last question for you personally. Would you forgive your brother if you found yourself in that circumstance?
I think I would struggle. I think that's one of the things that I've always created with my main characters, whether it be Joe Lachlan or Cyrus. I mean, I am basically a coward. Okay, I'm my mother's son. My mother once screamed so loudly in a cinema they stopped the film and turned the lights up. That's me. I don't watch horror films. I don't watch scary shows. I scare myself when I write. The characters I create, like Cyrus and Joe O'Loughlin, they're braver than I am. They're more intelligent than I am. They're more forgiving than I am. They're more insightful than I am. And I think that comes down to the wish fulfillment. I wish that I would be able to forgive my brother, but I don't think I could.
You know, I thought about that too when we were talking, and what gets in my way is that the risk to other people. I mean, I'm all right with you on capital punishment, you know, because indeed there are really terrible cases, and maybe locking somebody up for, you know, many years is worse than if you actually executed them. I mean, that's a horrible way of life, but I think I saw too many cases where people got it wrong about whether people should be released in society, and then everyone else paid a price for it.
Yeah. I mean, it does come down to what I keep telling myself, Barbara, is that we only ever hear about when it goes wrong, and there can be tens of thousands of cases where it doesn't go wrong.
Well, that's right. But how do you know which one it is?
I know, exactly.
You know,
and it is, and I think this is just the extra burden. And if I was in Cyrus' situation with my brother, I would basically watch them like, I mean, I would spend the rest of my life, I would just spend hovering over them. And it wouldn't be about protecting myself, but it'd be about protecting other people. Because if he did reoffend and hurt someone else, I don't think I could forgive myself.
Right. Well, you would feel responsible. And, you know, I will also say, since I have reached the age where these questions come up and I've spent time with him, a full-time caregiver job is exhausting. And it does, in fact, put you in jail in a way that you might not imagine. So none of these are easy questions, but that's kind of the point of reading Michael's book or thinking about these things. It really is. So anyway, that wasn't much of a Valentine Day ending here, but Michael, it's always such a pleasure to see you. And now that I know that you might actually come to the United States,
well,
any woman, I'm so excited. Yay, because I'll find copies of The Night Fairy and make everybody read it. So, anyway, thank you very much for the hour that you've spent with us. Jacob, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you.
I'll enjoy the rest of your evening or the rest of your day if you are down under.
And to everyone watching from America, happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good night, everybody. Bye.
Bye.